Hi, this is Paul. In my video yesterday, I talked a little bit about platforms, and I've been thinking a lot about this lately. I don't know if this will be a definitive video for me about this or just another video that's along the way. I don't know if I ever have definitive videos. They're all sort of videos along the way. But platforms for transformation and formation. Now, formation is sort of a buzzword in Christian circles. It has to do with catechesis, how the liturgy shapes us and molds us and frames us, and how community in the church does so, how teaching does so. All of these experiences and events, how they form us and really shape us into the kinds of Christians and creatures we are. Transformations, picking up on, say, how Jordan Peterson was using that word and often used it in his conversation with David Nasser at Liberty University, used it in his recent conversation with Brett Weinstein, Jordan wondering how many more transformations he could have in his life. Transformations are major transitions in one's life where they change religions or change something really significant and foundational about their life. And people have very limited transformations. Peterson noted that he saw people that he went to high school with who never had a single transformation. They were the same person. Well, not a single transformation. They were the same person that graduated from high school their whole life. Other people have, one, two, three, four, maybe five. That's a lot in a lifetime because transformations are very, very hard on the system. I keep coming back to that Brett Weinstein, Jordan Peterson conversation. I should probably do more work on it. And that's usually a sign that I didn't give it sufficient attention when my consciousness Congress, somebody in the back row says, "Hey, remember that?" And, oh, yeah, I should. That has to come into the broader conversation. Anyway, just with a couple of recent stories, in at least in the Christian side of things, the Beth Moore controversy has sort of been simmering in the Southern Baptist Convention. The Southern Baptists are a large denomination. They've been a fairly successful denomination. Some high-profile churches, such as Saddleback, Rick Warren is a Southern Baptist pastor. And part of the reason the Southern Baptists get so much attention, more so than, let's say, the Assemblies of God, which is also an enormous denomination in the United States, or, of course, the Roman Catholic Church, is that they're a favorite political target for sort of the way that the mass media likes to prop up evangelicals in the political space, and they're always sussing that out. And in some ways, the relationship between evangelicals and mass media is an interesting one because mass media keeps giving them so much power, whereas many have noted that other fairly significantly sized Christian movements get almost no press and therefore get very little attention and therefore don't play very big parts in the American imagination. In all fairness, the Roman Catholic Church is that way because they're in some ways tremendously divided. Joe Biden is, of course, certain religious news sites have been, almost continually promoting Joe Biden's faith bona fides, how he does go to church and all of that. But of course, the culture war runs right through the Roman Catholic Church in North America as well. But I've been thinking a lot about these platforms issues, watching this Beth Moore controversy go round and round, because, the Southern Baptists and conservative evangelicalism, there's always a debate, what positions may or may not women or out of the closet gays or married gays or people of what status or another may they fulfill what roles in church or another. And part of the whole woke political correct debate has done is really orient people to counting people by means of sex or skin color or background or something like this. And so while these debates go on in places like the Southern Baptist Convention and really many, many other denominations, including my own, another article comes out that fewer than half of Americans belong to a church. And this is the rise of the nuns. And I find so much of the conversations about news stories like these to be one-dimensional. One of the things that happened in the United States in the wake, basically the conclusion and the victory of the United States in the Cold War, is that, and also because of the counterculture in the 1960s, American church attendance began to decline dramatically, and nowhere in greater numbers than those who were more on the politically progressive and socially progressive side of things. And that's obviously been a subject that I've treated a number of times in my videos. But I think, again, it's not treated with the kind of attention that it really deserves, because it's enormously complex. And part of this is platforms in terms of what the church is and what the church does. Because one of the things that happened is that in the, let's say, church attendance starts to decline in the 60s and accelerates in the 70s and the 80s, especially among the mainline. There was something that church was providing for people that was no longer needed or wanted or sought after. Other things sort of came into the fore. Radio, television, the internet. And, Putnam wrote Bowling Alone. It isn't just church. And Robert Putnam has also written a very excellent book on religiosity in America. And so these subjects are enormously complex and require a lot of pondering. I should shout out to Ernest, sent me that art in the back right behind me. So thank you very much, Ernest. You know who you are. Let's keep going with the video. Again, some of the basic anthropology the language that I've been developing for some of this. We are memetic first draft absorbers. We're absorbing first draft maps of the world in our minds and hearts that we very quickly project back onto the world in order to filter the world and reduce disruptive dissonance. That's what we naturally do as human beings. And so we absorb these first drafts. We absorb first drafts about what it means to be a good person, what it means to be a father, what it means to be in a relationship, what it means to be a Christian. All of these things, we just absorb them. And it's not conscious. We don't sit there with us consciously. No, we absorb it. It's all baked into us. And our consciousness is sort of up front here, sometimes looking back at it. And of course, if you go into therapy or something like that, you might be surprised at, what happens, or if you have an emotional response to something that surprises you, and it's like, oh, I have this whole consciousness congress, and my conscious self is only one small aspect of this far larger, more complex creature. Storytelling is one of the earliest platforms. And you can imagine people gathering at night because you can't hunt or you can't do a lot of things. And so you warm yourself by the fire and you catch up with each other. And we watch each other. And again, back to Jordan Peterson's first biblical series, we watch each other, and we're first draft absorbers. We don't just absorb the first draft in terms of mental mappings, but we absorb them in terms of how we live. I don't just look like my father. I walked like my father. I talk like my father. I've got traits like my father. My father is deeply mapped into me. My mother is deeply mapped into me. I used to joke with people that, they're like their parents, and if their parents were biological, they're like their parents squared. They not only receive the genetic imprint, but they also receive the other first draft imprints. We don't just do this from people. We do this, you look at Native American spiritualities, people have animal, their animal selves, and they mimic the swaying of the grass, or, we're just always absorbing from our environment around us, whether that is a what we quote unquote natural environment, or if that's a much more human colonized environment. We abstract, and again, Vervaeke's relevance realization, we abstract stories and language out of it, and we share it with each other, and it just compiles and compiles and compiles and compiles. But, this is even before you have writing, even before you have, we're capturing it audibly. It's imprinting on us. You have poetry, which is oral. You have oral traditions. You have all of this. And this is this massively productive world compression engine. And then, of course, we get into representations, physical representations, cave drawings, statues, hieroglyphics, and eventually alphabets. And one of the things that, because these are platforms for formation, which tends to be more slow and repetitive, less conscious, and then transformations, which are big jumps, big movements, leaps of faith. And what we discover is, these ancient tools, still thousands of people, millions of people will travel to Egypt to be impacted by these platforms of statues and art and writing and language. Jordan Peterson asks, when you go into, let's say, the Metropolitan, one of the great, go to the Getty in Southern California, one of the great art exhibits, and you walk in there and you look at a painting and you don't even, why are you looking at this painting? I don't know. Why are millions of people coming to this place, a pilgrimage, we would call it, to look at this painting? You very quickly to see how these platforms develop, and we seek them out for formation and transformation. There's a sense in us of being drawn towards beyond ourselves, and you can theosis, because we've been talking to the Orthodox, that comes in, but various Christian traditions have other Christian names for it. Various other religions have other names for it. But we're looking for self-transcendence. We're looking for formations. We're looking for transformations. And John Vervaeke's whole project is about reducing the bullshittery that's in it and finding better and better transformations, etc. So we induce awe and formation and transformation by art and by song and by story and by literature. Awe is induced in dramatic landscapes. I've been watching the Vikings, the history show Vikings, and there's this dramatic waterfall, and of course, you find so often holy places and dramatic places, and you walk into Yosemite Valley and you look at El Capitan and it's just awe. And of course there's psychological layering for this and all sorts of other things. Mountaintops are where you put your altars, etc., etc. Now we cooperate and we compete around all of this stuff, because this awe-inducing. Wow, did you feel it like I did? Yes, you did. So now we have a bond between us, and I wrote this, and it induced awe in you, and back and forth, and that's what we're doing on YouTube right now. That's why you watch my videos, and it's why I read your comments, and why we're always doing these interchanges, and this is all mediated by representation and writing and language, and we make and claim platforms and we perpetuate them. Now, this is the most popular video on my church channel, and this is June 2, 2017, before I had made a single Jordan Peterson video. I was just playing with YouTube and just trying to think about it as a platform. What can I accomplish on this platform? And I was reading C.S. Lewis's Miracles, and I was thinking about altars. Well, altars are funny things. We, basically take this animal and we make this raised platform, and we put fire in it, and we throw the animal or some grain or something on top, and it burns up the animal and smoke goes up. Why does that work? And I was thinking about cosmology and all of those things. And so I made this video. It was 7 minutes, because videos had to be short. That's what I was told. Videos had to be short. So I there's a few of those old videos on the church channel that you can find way back in the archives. How altars work and how they fit into the story of the Bible. And you can see my usual rotation of hair and beard was in full swing at that point. It was summertime, because I was just wearing that shirt, and I was looking for a space around church that I could set up things, and all I had was a camera on a cell phone, so the sound is crappy, and well, there it is, and I used the whiteboard. But at the most basic level, religion is sort of the communal agent arena world management scheme. and religions are rich with art and representation and language and ritual and tradition, and it's the greatest possible frame that we use to try to manage who we are and what is salvation and how the world works. That's what religion really is. And it's rich with identities and relationships and narratives, and you have priests and temples and writings and rituals and substances, and just on and on and on and on and on. And yes, I'm sure, many religions, was that part of Christianity? I mean, that continues to be debated. There are substances that people would take in to induce a religious environment, or to induce a religious experience. But of course, the temples and the ritual and the songs and all of that is to also induce these awe experiences, these transformational and formative experiences. And of course, religion and politics are one. This is an early Tom Holland video with crappy sound, which is really quite excellent. Did religion exist in the ancient world? If you were to ask, did politics exist in the ancient world, we'd say, of course. But religion and politics were one in the ancient world. And it's really the separation of them, or at least the idea of the separation of them. I think the jury's still out as to whether or not that's actually possible. And part of what the United States is undergoing and Western societies are undergoing is in fact that question, or whether or not even our secularism is just sort of a little ways down the hierarchy of Christianity. And I'm finding more and more wokesters on Twitter basically starting to say that. And it's like, well, this is getting very interesting. But, priests served kings to help them manage the relationship with the gods for group success or failure. Temple and palace were pretty consistently joined, and they were linked platforms. And, in the Hebrews, you have the separation of prophet, priest, and king, which I think is a pretty powerful innovation. I've talked before about some of the differences among the Hebrews between their oracles and other oracles, and I won't go into that here. Peter Brown's excellent book, Through the Eye of the Needle, Wealth and the Fall of Rome and the Making of Christianity in the West, 350 to 550 A.D. Part of what Constantine does is that there's too many gods and too many sacrifices, and Augustine points this out. And so basically Constantine wants one God to rule them all and one God to rule through him. And of course, Constantine was a fairly successful emperor, and so that in sort of the instinctive karmic default religion, that's the way it goes. And so the Pontiff is actually the emperor, because the Pontiff is the bridge. The emperor is the bridge between the gods and humanity. You see this in Pharaoh. Pharaoh is a god. You learn that in Sunday school. Pharaoh's a god, but nobody bothers to say, well, what's the relationship between the king and the gods? And even in David, what's the relationship between God, David, and Israel? We don't teach that to children too much, partly because we've got this whole other system that we're using to sort of keep order and to keep things separate. Church and state have long struggled for supremacy. So if you look at Tom Holland's book about the first millennium, I've got the British copy here somewhere. I thought I had found a book, and no, it was a copy of a book that I had on Kindle. So I don't see it right here right now. But anyway, but again, platforms. These are platforms, and in many ways, kingdoms are platforms. And they use, well, what do they use? They use pageantry. They use vestments. They use palaces. They use violence. They use coercion. They use all of these mechanisms in order to sort of create this whole world. And in many ways, well, temple is part of that whole mechanistic structure. They're a platform, and you could have books, and you could have scribes, and again, part of what's been interesting in terms of watching Vikings has been, well, the Norsemen don't have much beyond runes. They don't really have writing, whereas now in the Middle Ages you have these monasteries, and you have these illuminated manuscripts, and you have Bishop Barron talked about this in his video on Vikings. You have a book, and so for the Christians, a book is very powerful. But the others look at the book and say, What is this? Throw this away. It's not worth anything. Oh, but it's a platform, and those who are initiated into the language can now use that platform for formation and transformation of others, and in fact, their whole world around them. That's what these platforms do. Now, of course, the printing press explodes the world, and an excellent book that I talked about quite a bit a while ago is Michael Massing's Erasmus, Luther, and the Fight for the Western Mind. And you see this happening with the printing press, because prior to this, well, literacy rates were lower and books were very expensive. And so the platforms, you still had your main platforms of religious institutions and religious / political institutions. Those were sort of the main platforms, and you had armies and killings and book and heretics burnings, and it all had power. And we look at a book burning and a heretic burning and we just see it as killing. But again, go back and look at that videos about altars, because, well, in a sense, with a book burning, you said, I'm going to devote this book to smoke and send it up to God. I'm going to devote this heretic to smoke and send him up to God. And these were the platforms that were used. But with the printing press now, suddenly individuals like Erasmus and Luther, and in Fatal Discord, it's very interesting because, printers, well, you scratch some money together and you get a printing press and you start playing with things, and maybe you get Greek type. And so you've got characters like Luther and Erasmus. There aren't any copyright or any of this legal mechanism now, really. So, printers are competing to get, I want Luther's latest book. And then, well, you get a copy of it and you just make other copies of it. And so you have this proliferation of information, and people are reading. And of course, reading can be with literature, can be a powerful formation and transformation. Books had long been used for formation and transformation. Monasteries and illuminated text, that was, again, the church, state, or kingdom. These were the platforms for transformation, but all of these platforms are deeply hierarchical. So let's call pre-printing press traditional platforms. There's very few of them that are actually operating in the world, at least compared to today. In fact, if you sit down and you think about it, very, very few. There's family, there's tribe, there's kingdom, there's temple and church. That's about it. That's not much. That's the whole game that they had. Now, because there were so few platforms, hierarchies were extremely important in them. And these platforms were doing a lot of service for the broad needs of human beings. And so hierarchies were very closely guarded, according to what the needs of the institutions and the platforms were. So you had hierarchical structures through which you could move people through propagation of images, messages, imitation, and violence. That's what these platforms did. Now, with the printing press, you just get an explosion because, of course, first there's the printing press, but again, technology develops, and of course, in the 20th century, we're going to see the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, we're going to see the massive proliferation of platform. I didn't even mention Thomas Edison and the phonograph. There's another one. But now you've got formative and transformative media could prompt and replicate experience on a mass scale. But also, the more platforms you have, the more differentiations of experience, because two people are reading the same book. And now always two people would be reading the same book, but you're reading the same book and going to the same church and listening to the same priest and doing the same rituals and in the same geographical location. Travel is going to become another element here. And very quickly, you're going to have telegraph and newspapers. And Neil Postman, and Amusing Ourselves to Death, writes quite a bit about these things. You're going to have printing houses and the multiplication of printing houses. It's very interesting. In bloody Kansas, very quickly you learn that, well, book burning doesn't really accomplish too much if someone else has a printing press. So what you really want to do is smash the printing press. And it's part of the reason why you burn and kill heretics too, because you shut them up. But once print is sort of out of the bag, well, And of course, now we're experiencing that on a whole new level with the internet. Once something on the internet, it's never erased. It's forever, we think, sort of, we fear, we hope. But in the modern period, you've got radio and then television. And again, the multiplication, and what this does is sort of reduces the hierarchies. And we used to have 3 networks, and then you had cable TV. And so what you see constantly is these elimination of hierarchies and gatekeepers. But yet, still in the modern period, in mass media, you had still limited gatekeepers, but now you have more of a meritocracy. You have, sounds get out there. I was mentioning that on Twitter that in some ways Gavin Newsom is the new Pat Boone, and nobody seemed to be able to get my joke. But if you just go on the internet and look at how many cover albums Pat Boone did for black artists. I mean, do you want to listen to Pat Boone or do you want to listen to Little Richard? Really? Because Little Richard was the genuine article, and Pat Boone was sort of this pasty white guy who sorts of promotes it for the white kids. And it's Gavin Newsom in some ways. I shouldn't talk politics, but sometimes it's just too much fun. But still in the modern period, you're sort of a central point to a massive audience. And then the internet. Now we have point to point. And now anybody can be a producer. And so, on one hand, there's the hope that, well, everyone can produce something, but then, hey, you've still got the Pareto principle. So there are other things that are going on that sort of limit its impact. Anybody can put out music, but the same people are still listening to the same music. And I've talked before about, well, mass media and internet. Mass media hasn't gone away, still has enormous clout. If the New York Times and the Toronto Star and, mass media and social media are in kind of a symbiotic relationship now. And there's still a validation that happens in mass media that social media can't quite afford, but that process is well on its way. And actually, David Fuller, I thought, had a really excellent conversation with Trigonometry on that. I have to keep my eye on the time because I have a 6 o'clock commitment today. But, look at 3D printing, VR, AR. I mean, this is just going to continue to explode, and it's all sorts of media. It's face-to-face, it's voice-to-ear, it's image-to-eye. It's all of this. And so what we see are the proliferation of platforms and the responses in real time. Now let's swing back to the church. Well, churches have a degree of power that doesn't go away. And it's not the case that internet replaces newspapers or internet replaces print or mass media replaces social media. When we see this new disruptive technology, that's often what we think, but that's often not the case. It gets displaced, but seldom is it completely replaced. I have a cousin whose wife is a farrier. She shoes horses. There are still horses around, and horses continue to be a part of our world, but a much smaller part. Hobbyists, because there are aspects and qualities that horses have that cars will never have. So this is part of what happens with the displacement of technology. And so church is being displaced. But how and with what? Church has sort of tried to keep up, but in the keeping up, that's a very dangerous game. And in fact, church structures, you look at, say, Protestantism as compared to the Orthodox, and then the Roman Catholic sort of in between. How are churches dealing with these disruptions in the broader world brought on by technology? It's very interesting to find, all of these Orthodox priests in robes and long beards, and they're on podcasts. And so, because of recommendations that I get from people, sometimes I listen to the Orthodox on podcasts, and sometimes they sound ancient and sometimes they don't. But of course, if I'm looking at one and they've got a long beard and a black robe, or if there's an icon in the back or something of this nature, okay, well, that's, again, the richer environment. So church has been in this game, and one of the advantages that church has is that it's massively broad. And whereas in bowling alone, of a lot of clubs have disappeared. One of the things that we've noted is that, a variety of IDW critter inspired Discord servers have opened and closed, and Bridges of Meaning is still going. Well, why is Bridges of Meaning still going? Well, probably partly because of some cultural church DNA that I bring to it, and that the other Christians bring to it, because Christians know more than they know about how to keep a community in existence. Churches are massively broad in terms of, well, we see each other face to face, we smell each other, we touch each other. There's texture, there's tactile, it's physical, and that's part of its strength, and that those strengths aren't easily duplicated via screens or paper. Now, those strengths always have downsides and liabilities, and we're not even aware of the degree to which these things function. We've learned some lessons about that during COVID. The interactions in church are far more 360. When I interact with an avatar on Twitter, that's one thing, and there's just way too much room for projection and stuff. If I'm meeting a person face to face, there's so much more context. Now, if I see a person every week or multiple times a week, year after year after year after year, which is what church membership and context affords, well, this person might be really good at that, but they're kind of flaky with this. And so you get much higher resolution into the person's life, and that affords a much richer context for trust. And, again, the more I get into this stuff, the more I see in church why churches are the way they are and can succeed and sometimes fail. But in some ways, church is losing a race of the formative and transformative experience delivery because, well, you're watching me on YouTube, and we've got a pandemic, and, if you go to the local church, well, what do you get at church? Well, there's a sermon, but, I like what Pastor Paul is saying over here more than what local Pastor Fred is saying over there. But local Pastor Fred has a building that I can drive to, and there's other people that I can fellowship with. And, I've been noting this, talking to church planters. My friend Rod would get requests because what happens with people is they sort of graze. They're like, well, this church has good worship, and this church has good preaching, and this church has good small groups, and this church has a dynamite coffee shop in their lobby. And so what they sort of do as religious consumers is start piecing things together and their ideal church matrix together. But this consumerism itself is sort of is doing a number on this, but churches are very much dealing with this environment. And, even my YouTube channel is a part of this environment, and I don't exactly know what to do about it or not. So we're playing it out, and we're watching and waiting, and, I suppose if I come to the point and say, my YouTube channel is harming the kingdom of God, I shut it down and I take it offline. I haven't come to that idea, and I think it's been on the whole productive, but I wonder. The problem is that even a deeply conservative church like the Orthodox, well, they're playing online. Well, why? Well, because they're not dumb. And how does the online, so Sunday mornings, again, Rick and I sometimes look at other churches and their cameras and what they're doing, and there's the OKC Orthodox Church. I was listening to a series on the Gospel of John from them. So they're in my YouTube feed. So Sunday mornings they live stream, and again, here's this static camera with this huge image in terms of their cathedral, and I don't know what to think. I don't know what to think. I look at it and think, I don't know if I'd go to a church like that. Well, why not? Because I'm a consumer. Well, I'm a Protestant. I'm all of these things. And I have a great deal of sympathy for many of you, because if I did not have living stones to pastor, it's been years, really, college, that was back in the 1980s, that I was just sort of a regular church person, where I'm a rut person, so once I pick a church, I usually like to commit to it and stick with it, because certain kinds of change I don't like. And so I tend to be one of those people that stays until the last dog dies. So that's just part of my temperament. But church is a platform. And as I'm watching all of this stuff going on, this is an issue. Churches still use hierarchies, but churches act like they mean something that I don't think they mean. And I think that's where this Beth Moore controversy really comes up. And even this picture. So I've made this point in some previous videos recently. The whole controversy about women bloggers. Beth Moore has an enormous platform. Instagram Christians have enormous platforms. I mean, Rick Warren was a very big deal and built a church growth empire on his enormously popular book, Purpose Driven Life, conferences, his mega church, but I've probably got almost as many subscribers to my YouTube channel as Rick Warren has people who show up to church. Now, that's not a one-to-one comparison by any means, because one of the things that you learn is that when your channel's really small and growing very quickly, when you've got more views than subscribers, as your channel grows, you get more subscribers than views. And so when you look at metrics on a social media platform, it's even difficult to know what that means. That's not unusual for church, because pastors have long been looking at church as platforms. And so local churches are platforms, denominations are platforms, publishing houses are platforms. Billy Graham and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Organization became a platform. Having evangelistic crusades was a platform. Christian music is a platform. Recording is a platform. And you just see that and we're living with all of these platforms intermingled. I was talking to one of my church planting buddies about a pastoral care situation in his church, and he basically said, pastors would like to imagine that a member of their congregation has a spiritual or personal question, and so they bring it to you and ask for your advice, and then you give them your advice, and they listen, and they go therefore and do it. That is the furthest thing from the case of what happens with pastors. Because by the time someone gets to you, they've probably already made up their mind and are going to declare to you what they've come to. And the influencers that have influenced them are from how many different platforms all over the map. And so every local pastor is already sort of a compromise. So many compromises down the line in terms of how much influence does a local pastor have. Nothing near Beth Moore. But yet churches are fighting. I mean, how much influence does Milo Yiannopoulos have in the Roman Catholic Church? Now, certainly less than the Pope. I'd say certainly less than Bishop Barron. Probably more than Cale Zeldin. Think about it. We have no idea how to manage this in the church. how to process this. I'm making this video because I've never heard anybody before. I'm sure it's happened, but I've never heard anybody. Well, it's intimated in how many other podcasts. But Christianity Today, enormously influential magazine that is waning because, of course, well, now they got to start a podcast because they realize that their magazine doesn't have the influence it once had. But as is almost always the case, the podcast they start pales in significance to the magazine because, well, they're probably been spending all of that time figuring out how to make a magazine, and the podcast is just something that they're sort of rough drafting out there and shooting from the hip. Whereas some other Christians making a podcast will eat them for lunch. I mean, that's how these technological disruptions go. That IBM was, of course, the big computer. I mean, they were the big organization, but then now there's Apple, and there's always going to be these successor corporations. And now we're in the world of hegemony of Apple and Google and Facebook. But all of these corporations are very anxious because they know the speed at which these disruptions happen. Well, here's the church in the middle of this. And it's an attention economy, and the church gets how much attention? And so we ought to think about these platforms. Now, platforms are laborers, labelers. People need labels. Labels are relevance realization, complexity reduction strategies. I just had a little conversation on Twitter about this. You can only cope with so much dissonance and novelty. Again, a point that Jordan Peterson made in his conversation with Brett Weinstein. Confessionalism in church was an adaptation of propositional truth in order to sort of put things on the shelf so you can deal with other things. And confessionalism is a long conversation I've had in the Christian Reformed Church with some of the things on our plate. Platforms are disruptive and replaced all the time. So Back to God Hour was the radio broadcast of the Christian Reformed Church in the 1930s and 40s and had a lot of power into the 70s and 80s, and then became Back to God Ministries International. And the platform has attempted to transform to try to keep up with the times, but it is not anywhere near the power that it had back with, in my youth, it was Joel Naderhood. That was a big name that most of you don't recognize. But before that, it was, I can't even remember. I'd have to look up some of the books on my shelf because I wasn't around for that. Platforms are disrupted and replaced, and we have no idea how disruptive this will become for communal institutions we need. And so we sort of develop new ones, but those new ones don't have the institutional memory, and this is what we have with church planting all the time. And so part of the reason I'm such a promoter of church planting in my space is because church plants adapt easier than established churches. Living Stones is dying. Will another thing grow out of Living Stones? Well, something already has. But what does it mean? I have no idea. Fast adaptation is one strategy, but again, there's this other quote that Peterson has where change too much, you lose. Change not fast enough, you lose. Where in the middle is that space? Who's to know? There's always an advantage. I mean, part of the advantage that the Orthodoxy has is change gets going too fast. People are like, I need something that doesn't change. Oh, look, the Orthodox Church. It doesn't change. The Roman Catholic Church, it doesn't change. That's actually a strategy. One strategy for dealing with change is no, I won't change. I don't care what you do. I'm told the Amish are doing pretty well. There's a strategy. And the faster change in society, probably the more people are going to look for places that don't change. But when they go to these places that don't change, they change them. So this is what we're in for. And we don't know where we're going. So keep talking, thinking, praying. That's my strategy. And yeah, platforms. Let me know what you think.